I imagine that this is going to be one of my most viewed and anticipated videos when it comes to breaking down the Season 2 patch for Granblue, namely because Belial has been a very strong character throughout the game's existence, even in its original state as Granblue Fantasy Versus, without the Rising. After so long of being a high-tier character and arguably being one of the best characters in the previous patch, they finally come for Belial, so let's see what damage they've done to this character. Crouching Medium has probably been Belial's most iconic normal since his introduction. A plus on block low with decent range to it that allows Belial to run up, get in your face with it, and then implement a shimmy strike throw minigame. It was also quite spammable in block strings. With the pushback that it had before, you'd be just outside of a lot of close L ranges, meaning that the opponent could challenge with their 6-frame 5L. Because of the +1 frame advantage, as well as the medium priority of the move, you would actually be able to crush a 6-frame far light mash against the opponent. Meaning that basically you kind of had to respect this pressure overall. And you could threaten this minigame up to 3 times. There was a lot of ways that side games and Arxis could have gone about nerfing this normal, and the way that they eventually settled on was to its pushback. It's pretty dramatically increased. Now Belial can no longer get 3 2Ms in a block string. You can only get up to 2. Furthermore, this also is true for the corner. This is a pretty substantial nerf to Belial's overall pressure game because instead of being able to safely mind game the opponent 3 times, you only get 1 mind game from it. This also hurts his strike-throw game. If you were point blank and did this normal, you could immediately go into a throw on the opponent. Compare that to now. You pretty much always have to take a little walk forward with Belial to get the opponent. This means that the mix-up is a lot more reactable than it was before, and it puts Belial a little more risk because if the opponent chooses to mash and you commit to this, instead of getting a throw tech from them, you instead get mashed on completely. So now, the opponent has a lot more leeway in terms of their RPS against Belial. For my testing, this really doesn't affect the situation if he tries to go for command throw. In the old patch, a point blank 2M into his command throw would hit on frame 27. The same is true for the current patch. So that still has the same effectiveness at least. This also means that his reward for frame trapping you with mediums here is reduced a little bit. Previously, at a point-blank range, you'd be close enough for Belial to get his close medium attack. With the new pushback, you're now pushed into far medium range. Of course, since you're pushed farther out and you're at this far medium range, it means that Belial's rewards for correctly frame trapping you, if he wants to invest in some of his skills, are also greatly reduced. Now you can get about a 3,555 damage. Compare that to before. There's even more damage I could get here as well if I went for EX Asmodeus to get the wall bounce. Basically, Belial lost about 1,000 damage and half-screen corner carry from this one change alone when it comes to his frame traps, because instead of being in close medium range, he's now too far away in order to get that. It is worth noting that while you may not be in close medium range after a point-blank 2M in the current patch, you are within range for a close heavy. So if you want to get the similar strings that you had before, you have to commit to a close heavy. However, that is riskier in its own way. For starters, you won't actually frame trap light mashes in this situation. Light mashing will beat you pretty cleanly here. It's pretty impressive how this one change to 2M alone does so much to hurt the character overall. It hurts his pressure game by limiting the amount of interactions he's able to force you into that are all advantageous for him, and nerfs the confirms he's able to get even after he chooses to go for this option a single time, as well as reduces the overall effectiveness of his rewards when he does actually get you to guess incorrectly on these hits, and gives him the opportunity to combo you. Pretty impressive work for a nerf. That's not the only normal of Belial's that got nerfed as well. 5 Heavy has a couple of changes to it. Previously, if you were close enough to the opponent, you would force them to go into proximity guard with the first hit of the advancing 5H. This meant that it was harder for the opponent to try and walk out of this normal from neutral, giving Belial a way to aggressively close the gap and force the opponent into a situation where they'd have to block. Now, the first attack of 5 Heavy no longer triggers this proximity guard. So the opponent is more reliable, able to walk away from Belial and cause this normal to whiff, which greatly nerfs his neutral. They've also revamped the pushback on block as well for both of the hits. The first hit has increased pushback, while the second hit has reduced pushback. When both of these moves hit together, the total pushback hasn't been changed, but it does change the situations when only one of these hits connects. Let's take a look at what happens when the second hit connects, which is something that would often happen from like using this move as a poke and neutral. Now, funnily enough, if you don't actually hold it down back or back at all, then you don't trigger proximity guard and you don't block this normal, at least in the old patch. Compare that to the new patch with the reduced pushback on block for the second hit. Without holding anything, I'm hit pretty cleanly here, meaning that I pretty much have to force a block in this situation. This will also affect some special situation cancels for Belial since he can only special cancel the first hit of 5 heavy. One thing that I've noted that is a negative impact is how this interacts with his command throw. In the previous patch, you could get it to come out nearly on its first active frame, which is frame 27, or sometimes, depending on your spacing, it would reach just a little bit later. Like that example, it hit at frame 29. If you're close enough, then we'll connect to that frame 27 I mentioned. With the increased pushback on the first hit, this means that the command throw has more opportunities to hit at later frames, making it more reactable against the opponent. It is still possible to get a hit at frame 29 and frame 27, but at some farther ranges, this is going to hit incredibly late. I don't think it's too much of a difference here, but if you have some muscle memory that's based around threatening with this option, you might have to revisit what your actual frame data is going to be. I've already talked about the nerfs to give Daddy some sugar, as well as to the counter portion of his ultimate command throw, but I wanted to make sure that I made mention of it here because it is another significant nerf to Belial that deserves to be contextualized with the rest of the nerfs. Since Give Daddy Some Sugar now does a second hit that leaves Belial at -4 and right next to the opponent, Belial is forced to take a strike throw mix-up. You're right within throw range against the opponent now always. You can, of course, walk back out of this throw, which gives you punishes like that. However, if the opponent wants to call out that walk backwards, something with like low 2Ls, well, you better have really good fuzzy defense or something because I don't see how you escape this. My walk back gets caught by the lows right there, so you're forced to pretty much decide between taking a jab and short combos worth of damage, or trying to tech a throw situation, or if you even mash on that situation in the first place. It's a loss worth for Belial right now just because of all those different outcomes. It's worth mentioning, though, that you should still be able to buffer a DP here. It can be a little bit tricky, but now it's a lot more committal than it was before, especially because the other options result in, well, Belial taking a mix-up. With the changes to his counters, that basically means that Belial's best skip neutral tools are now pretty terrible for using it for that purpose. If you're ever going to be using these counters, you shouldn't be throwing them out willy-nilly or on a hard read because the situation for you is genuinely kind of bad. I would instead recommend using it only for situations where you're getting guaranteed counters on it instead, which probably is a very fair way to have this character be balanced in the first place. You already had a really good neutral before. The fact that you could just skip some of his zoning matchups and get right into a sweet spot range pretty much for free was a huge part, I think, as to why this character had such a great matchup spread before. His heavy fireball, Goetia, also sees several nerfs to it. Previously, if you didn't do a follow-up with it, you were +2 on block, giving Belial yet another way of forcing his turn again. With this +2 frame advantage, this meant that you could true string into the light or medium version of Everyone's a Little Crooked. While this doesn't really look good in terms of frame data, the reality of the situation is Belial still had plenty of plus frames to work with here. If the opponent tried to mash on you, the projectile would stay close enough to them where it was still active, so if they did press, they would actually take a hit. The light version wouldn't be the case, but the medium version would be, so Belial had another way of cheesing his turn back against an opponent, even in a crouching stance. This frame advantage also meant that it would frame trap mashes if Belial ever went for the heavy follow-up of Everyone's a Little Crooked. Meaning that basically the opponent was forced to use an invincible reversal here or choose to hold the mix-up. So if they didn't have access to a reversal, they were put into a massive amount of plus frames for free. The advantage on block has been significantly reduced, so instead of being +2, Belial is now -2. This affects a lot of the situations regarding his follow-ups to Goetia. For starters, because Goetia is now negative on block, this means that there's a mashable gap, and if he does the heavy, everyone's a little crooked follow-up now. This is a huge nerf to Belial. Instead of him basically taking free turns against the opponents and forcing them into a pretty strong strike-throw mix-up, if they weren't willing to commit to a reversal, that is, now a good opponent can look for that version and mash on Belial for a punish. While the situation on block is certainly worse, it is important to note that if you're trying to use heavy Goetia into heavy, everyone's a little crooked on a crouching opponent, you pretty much get the same combo routes that you did before. That link still exists in this current version as well, so Belial's overall combo game should be pretty similar in situations that you're used to. Belial isn't without options in this situations. Now he's going to have to be looking to use other versions of Everyone's a Little Crooked to try and frame trap that call-out mash on the heavy version. For example, the medium version looks pretty promising here, as it drags the opponent back towards you and gives Belial a +6 situation. This generally mean that Belial's going to get a far medium confirm, though it is possible to get a close medium as well. It is a little tricky to time, and there's a lot of variances to the sequence, but I wanted to demonstrate that it's possible. However, that's the situation if the opponent chooses to mash and gets hit. If they choose to block this out, Belial's actually in a really terrible spot. He pushes the opponent right back into himself, and he's -4 in this situation, unable to run his offense. He might catch the opponent off guard because they're trying to discern what version of Everyone's a Little Crooked that he's going for, but a savvy opponent who trains their reactions is going to know that in this situation, it's their turn to swing now. Now's a good time to also talk about changes to Everyone's a Little Crooked's light and medium follow-ups as well, as there's significant changes that overall impact the situations that Belial can get using these cancel options. Previously, if you threw these out, they would slow down when they hit the opponent, while also leaving them in a crouching hit state. If the opponent was standing, then they would also stay standing. The hitboxes would also linger for quite a bit of time upon contact with the opponent. There's some changes to the properties of Everyone's a Little Crooked in terms of its follow-ups for light and medium now. On hit, they force standing. This is nice just to make sure that if you do hit the opponent with it, you get all hits of it and the extra little bit of damage with it too. So it's a nice little change. This change in forcing the opponent to go into a standing state does give Belial access to some new combo routing. Previously, that far light drops in the old patch. Compare that to now. Whereas now you're actually able to get that link. This is, I think, inferior to just going for the heavy follow-up anyway, but I suppose if you want to just go ahead and use this combo route instead for some reason, that option is available to you now. As I demonstrated previously, if you did the light and medium versions of Everyone's a Little Crooked as follow-ups on the opponent, they would travel a shortened distance after making contact with the opponent and linger above them. This behavior has been changed in the current patch. Now, the projectiles will travel the same distance as if they whiffed in the first place, regardless of making contact with the opponent, and as soon as they make contact with the opponent, the projectiles will disappear. This namely nerfs the situation in the corner that I demonstrated earlier, where Belial could use these versions to steal his turn back. Without that projectile lingering there, Belial is just sucking the opponent inwards in order to be put into a -4 situation. This completely ruins the light and medium follow-ups for Goetia as means for Belial to also keep the opponent guessing on what he's going to do after his pressure. There's one final nerf to Goetia to talk about, and that's to the ultimate version. On block, when it goes into the automatic follow-up, in the mid-screen, it would pretty much keep the opponent in lockdown. This gave Belial a pretty easy approach in with this fireball, as he could use it from full screen and then close the gap. Depending on the timing when you run up, of course, there's a lot of things that you can do here, and it basically meant that if Belial was able to bully his way in with this, he would be able to start off his offense for pretty low cost. Now, if the opponent blocks his ultimate Goetia, the follow-up will drag them away from Belial. This pretty much hurts this move's function as an approach tool for Belial or as a lockdown tool. You don't really get to close the gap. By this point, the opponent is able to act, and you're pretty much fighting for neutral again. I suppose in the corner, it still has some utility. And honestly, Belial's probably going to need this considering how all of his other tools got nerfed. It bears mentioning that on hit, the opponent isn't dragged backwards. So pretty much all the old existing combo routes that Belial would use this in still exist. And I think it also bears mentioning that if Belial is trying to push you to the corner, he can use this as an option to get you all the way there. So there is some new utility here. It's not all nerfs. I've already covered the nerfs to Belial's DPs in the system mechanic changes. Just know that he's more unsafe on block now, -13 instead of -10, so you should be able to get better punishes against him and more consistent punishes. After spending a lot of time as a top-tier character, Belial has probably finally been clipped down into a mid-high tier level, where he's still a good character, but he definitely has some weaknesses and issues right now. I think that the changes to his 2M, as well as the light and medium follow-ups to Everyone's a Little Crooked, are justified, as well as the change to his ultimate Goetia, but I can't help but feel like maybe the one step where they went a bit too far was changing heavy Goetia to now be negative on block and making so that you can mash on him if he goes for the heavy follow-up. I could be overselling the nerf situation. It could still function pretty much fine, and maybe there's just RPS that Belial has to engage in now for the opponent to be considerate of as well. I've already explored some of that here, and there's some potential still, but we'll see overall how Belial performs in this patch. I think, again, he's still going to be a good character, but he's not going to have as many obvious strengths that is going to be as endless and as repetitive as they were before, and I think he's a little healthier for it. We'll see how many Belial mains want to stick with the character going forward. He did deserve some nerfs, and as someone who has considered Belial his main character for the bit, these are the nerfs I'm going to have to hold, so we'll see what happens.